Thank you all so much for coming. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. She's Professor Helen Zha from the Chemical and Biological Engineering Department, and she will talk to us about sustainable materials. Take it away, Helen.
Thanks, Lucy. So my job as a chemical engineering professor here at RPI affords me this wonderful opportunity to follow my curiosity. And so the research in my lab aims to understand how natural materials and processes and systems function, and to leverage that understanding to help develop new innovations that can hopefully benefit society. And the work I'm going to talk about today is particularly on understanding how can natural systems help us meet our sustainability goals. So we like to take inspiration from material systems in my lab. And one of the materials that we're very inspired by is silk, which is nature's high performance plastic. So you might be familiar with the silk of the Bombyx mori silkworm, the domesticated silkworm, which has been valued for its strength and toughness and shine for centuries, actually, in the fashion industry. Actually, a lot of other insects also make silk, usually not in their adult forms, but in their larval states. So this here's a weaver ant found in Southeast Asia. The ant, as an adult, doesn't make silk, but its ant larva, which you see it's holding in its jaws here, actually does make silk. And the adult weaver ants actually use the larva as like hot glue guns. So they will move the larva back and forth across all of these really large leaves, and the silk is then gluing the leaves together so that the colony can live in this like giant leaf fortress held together by the silk here. So this silk is extremely adhesive, but also very strong. And of course, we're all familiar with spider webs. Spider silk is known to be very strong and stretchy and tough, but actually, did you know that there's 6 different types of silk in just one spider web? So for example, here, if we look at the radial silks that are running like bicycle spokes into the center of the web, those are the structural components of the web. So they're very strong and they're pretty stiff, but they're not so stretchy. Whereas the circumferential threads, these are the ones that run in a circle around the web, these are very stretchy, and their whole purpose is to dampen the impact of prey as it hits the web. Now, the spider also actually makes other silk, like you'll see little droplets of what looks like dew on these circumferential threads. That's not dew, that's actually a glue type silk, an adhesive silk that will help capture the insects as they hit the web. And actually, one of my most recent interests is this jumping spider. Now, jumping spiders also make silk, though they don't use it for prey capture. They actually use this silk, tethering it on one end where they're launching off from, and they use it to recorrect their trajectory as they're flying through the air. And the speed at which they make this silk is very fast. They're making about 0.5 meter per second. So that's 100 body lengths of silk material per second. And this silk is also extremely robust. In our lab, we think about silk again as nature's high performance plastic. And in fact, silk can be a potential alternative to all the fossil based plastics that we use in society today. So silk is known to be biocompatible, generally speaking. And in fact, you'll find silkworm silk as a component of sutures that you can already buy on the market today if you've ever had a silk-based suture. And people are also looking at using silk coatings as a way to prevent food spoilage, for example, covering fruit in it. And it's an edible silk coating. Silk is also flame resistant. So this is an image that demonstrates how you can tell if your silk clothing is genuine silk. If that's the case, it actually won't burn. It'll just char. Whereas if it's artificial silk, like a silk, faux silk, usually that's polyester or some other petroleum-based plastic, it'll burn and it'll sustain a flame. And so that's how your quote unquote silk fabric isn't real silk. And actually, if you are familiar with material science as a field and you recognize this as a stress strain curve, if we actually look at the properties of silk, the mechanical properties of silk, we see that it actually is quite similar to nylon, which is a fairly high performance plastic. And if you were to able to get your hands on a large piece of silk, it would feel very similar to nylon. But it's actually tougher than Kevlar and tougher than nylon and is stronger than nylon. So again, incredibly robust material that can have a lot of potential applications. It's also able to be processed in water, which is quite unique for a high-performance plastic. It's biodegradable because it's essentially a protein, so it's made out of amino acids and nature can break it down easily. You'll never have microplastic pollution that exists in the environment from silk. It's naturally antimicrobial and it can be made in renewable ways. So Silk is extremely useful, and some of the research in my lab, for example, investigates how we can create coatings on silk on surfaces to decrease bacterial attachment. So here on the left, 2 pieces of stainless steel that have been colonized by Staphylococcus or E. coli bacteria. And then on the right, these pieces of stainless steel have silk coatings on them, and actually the bacteria don't adhere to the silk. Another thing that we've done in our lab is to look at the ability of silk coatings to enhance scaffolds designed for nerve tissue regeneration. And we see that neurites from these cells that we've cultured on top of these silk coatings extend a lot further, meaning they could be more potent for nerve tissue repair. So silk is a very useful material, but how do we go about actually getting silk, right, for our potential commercial applications? And so here I have a video of how you might extract or harvest silk from a spider. You actually would anesthetize the spider and you pin it down, and then you slowly start reeling this thread from the spider spinneret. Now, of course, this is not a very scalable way to get a large amount of silk. The spider is going to tap out after just a little bit of material, and it's not very scalable, right? We can't do this with large amounts of spiders very efficiently. Of course, commercial sericulture, which is how we get silkworm silk, is already done at fairly large scales for the textile industry. And here, there's a lot of environmental impacts that we have to think about. This is usually something that happens in Southeast Asia, where the environmental conditions support the growth of a lot of mulberry leaves, which is what the silk larva will eat as they go through their life cycle. This requires massive amounts of water and, of course, a lot of land. And usually this is not a particularly environmentally sustainable method of getting large amounts of silk. Plus, we're tied to the properties of the silkworm silk. We don't really have a lot of opportunity to tailor the properties of that silk for our particular applications. In our lab, we create silk-like materials, but we do it differently. We don't use these insect or arachnid systems. We actually make artificial silk in our lab through bacterial fermentation. And this is a project that I have been working on with my collaborator, Mateus Kofas, in chemical engineering for the past 6 years or so. So our platform of choice is bacteria. They are fast growing, they reach high density in liquid culture, and they're relatively easy to genetically modify. And so using modern microbiology tools, we engineer various bacteria strains to produce our product of choice, which in this case is a silk-like plastic. And ultimately, this we see as a method of, instead of using fossil-based chemicals and high temperatures and harsh chemistries to make biodegradable or not, to make plastics, which are again often non-biodegradable, we can actually use living organisms that live in water and require only modest temperatures to make plastics that can potentially be very high performance and also be naturally biodegradable. So when I start describing this idea, which is to use living organisms to make the materials that we use on a daily basis, a lot of people start to think, is this even possible? Is this some Star Trek fantasy future? Will it really work at large scale? And they're right to wonder, because there are a lot of science and engineering challenges that we need to solve to make this happen at a scale that would impact society. But I'd like to point out that we already use living organisms to make many of the commercial products that we use in our daily lives. So I'm sure you recognize beer, right? This is a $550 billion industry. And if you look at large-scale beer brewing operations, they look like chemical factories, but they are using yeast to create the product, which is beer. Cheese also is something that we've been making as a society for thousands of years, probably. $157 billion industry, again, uses a living organism to create this product. Bioethanol, which has really taken a hold in the last few decades, is also made using fermentation processes and living organisms. And even something like vaccine manufacturing, which is exceptionally complex. It uses really high maintenance mammalian cells that are finicky and complicated to grow. This is also done at very large scale commercially. So we already have the infrastructure and the engineering knowledge in the space of biomanufacturing. Making our plastics using biology, to me, is a reasonable next step. And not only is it a reasonable next step, I'm going to make an argument that it is a highly beneficial next step. So one of the benefits of using a natural living system to make our materials is that we use water instead of organic solvents to do these synthesis reactions. Now, we also use a diverse or heterogeneous feedstock, which is just to say we can feed the organisms a range of things. We don't need to use pure components, pure monomers and reagents, which is what chemistry usually requires to make the plastics that we have today. Just like you and I, bacteria can metabolize and utilize and eat a lot of different things. They have preferences, but they can work with a lot of different things, which means we can start feeding them what is not extremely expensive, and still they will make really high value stuff. The waste products that come out of these processes are often less toxic than your chemical synthesis processes. And we have precise control over the chemical structures of the molecules that we synthesize, which is actually very difficult for traditional polymer chemistry to accomplish. The synthesized materials are biodegradable because they are made by nature. They contain natural components that nature naturally knows how to break down. And we can actually reduce the dependence on petrochemical feedstock by converting agricultural products or waste from certain industries into our bio-based plastic, which is to say that we can feed our bacteria waste products instead of something derived from fossil fuels, and it will use that to make the plastics that we are looking to create. So at this point, I'm going to connect my inspiration from silk with another thing. Again, this is not nature-based, but this is something else that continually inspires me in my research, which is Star Trek, The Next Generation. So I think Star Trek is a great show, and specifically The Next Generation. From a scientific perspective, they were very perceptive, and they had a lot of things in that show that turned out to actually come true in the following decades. So one of the things was in 1989, you could see Dr. Beverly Crusher here is holding an iPad and a pencil, right? But this is way before iPad and iPad pencils came about as commercial reality. So they had this excellent foresight. And in 1992, there was an episode where Worf had a severe spinal cord injury, and it was able to be repaired by essentially reconstructing this sort of spinal cord scaffold, which looks a lot like what we do with 3D tissue culture, 3D printing for tissue regeneration today. And he was able to repair and regenerate his spinal cord using this constructed scaffold and donor cells. So that is, again, also something that we're seeing very much at the forefront of tissue engineering today. So Star Trek, very far ahead looking, very good inspiration. And one thing that I started thinking about when I was watching Star Trek, one big thing, one question that came to mind is, you watch the show, where are the trash cans? So this is, in my mind, the future that we should aspire to. But in this future, I never see any trash cans and I never see any waste around. So where are the trash cans on this spaceship that they live in? And I think what's happening here is their replicator technology, right? So if you know the show, you know what this is. This is a machine that creates everything they need on the ship by converting matter and energy into an entirely different object. And to me, though they'd never explicitly state this, they must be dealing with their waste by using the atoms, that matter and energy in the waste, and converting it into some product that they want. So this to me was not something, obviously, we don't have a replicator technology today, but this is great inspiration because this kind of waste to product conversion is exceptionally complicated for chemistry to do, but it is possible when we use living organisms. And I'm going to give you an example of how that looks. So one question we started asking about our ability to make bioplastics using microbes is, can we use our engineered microbes to convert something that is a large waste stream for us in society, that's waste plastic, into a high value product? So we as a society generate a lot of waste plastic that's non-biodegradable. This plastic, literally, we produce by millions of tons every year, will go into the environment, landfill, etc., and they will stay there for hundreds to, if not 1,000 years, because they're non-biodegradable. Can we upcycle that waste into a high-value product, such as a bioplastic, so that it can go into a sustainable economy? So here's where we say microbes to the rescue. We call this process microbial upcycling. So we are engineering a strain of bacteria that can consume waste polyethylene, which is one of the most common plastics that we use. It's non-biodegradable, often used in plastics packaging, single-use applications. And our microbes will then turn it into silk protein, which is, it's again here, a biodegradable, renewable plastic with a high value across a variety of industries. So the bacteria platform of choice that we use is Pseudomonas bacteria. This is a bacteria genus that has many species involved. Many of them have unique metabolic capabilities. They have been shown to be able to eat a wide variety of carbon sources, for example, oil, BPA, low-density polyethylene. And they've also been able to show that they can produce a plastic called bacterial polyester. So that's very interesting. And actually, what we've been doing in our group is to engineer this Pseudomonas bacteria to be able to create genetically encoded tailored products like a silk protein. So the platform looks a bit like this. We would see here we have collaborators at Argonne National Lab that take polyethylene and they do a little bit of a chemical process to essentially pre-digest it for a bacteria into short waxes, wax-range alkanes, to make it easier for a bacteria to metabolize. And after that first pre-digestion step, we actually feed the wax, which came from polyethylene, to our bacteria. And so you can hear this is a flask, which has the wax in it. And the bacteria, as they are consuming the wax, they grow. So the culture is becoming more and more turbid. And at the same time as they are growing, they are also producing this silk protein that we've engineered them to produce, which we can then harvest and process. And so this silk here, all of the carbon atoms that is in this silk came from polyethylene. So we've converted a waste into something useful and entirely different. So to me, this is a long-term research area where we ask ourselves, how can we use nature to upcycle waste into valuable products? And it's going to need a lot of work from a lot of different folks. We need people who can think about waste plastics and how do we treat them or pre-digest them or sort them in a way that we can feed them to engineered bacteria. We need the synthetic biology and metabolic engineering folks to design strains of bacteria that produce useful product or efficiently eat this food. And then we also need the reactor engineers to design reactors that handle this efficiently, and the people who work on purifying the product to, in the cheapest way possible, purify what the bacteria is making. And then once we have that, we send that off to the people who will turn that into a fork or cling film or whatever the final product is. So this is a multidisciplinary effort, and I'm very excited about where this is going in the future. So in the last few minutes, I'm going to talk briefly about a project that I have that really looks at how do we use our artificial silk in a potentially commercial space. And so this is a project in collaboration with several professors in mechanical engineering, as well as a professor in Haas, where we are taking plant fibers, such as hemp-based fiber. So this is a hemp stalk, and you can extract this fiber from the outside of it. This is bast fiber. And normally you would make this into a yarn, but the yarn isn't very attractive for fashion apparel wear because people consider it too coarse and itchy, and it's not luxurious enough. And so we asked ourselves, how can we add a little bit of our silk protein that we made through fermentation to enhance the properties of this hemp-derived yarn for apparel wear? So increase its robustness, its luster, and its luxe hand feel. And at the end, we'll still have an 100% bio-based and biodegradable fiber, which is sustainable. So we developed this process by which we take hemp yarn and we send it through an infusion machine, infuse it with a little bit of our artificially fermented silk protein, and at the end we get a yarn which we call hemp silk. It's a composite yarn. And when we tested this hemp silk yarn, we saw that it had 67% higher toughness and 39% more stretch with just a tiny amount of our silk added. And it also seemed to be shinier and more luxe looking. And when we priced this out in a preliminary work, we saw that the price is still quite reasonable for commercial deployment. You don't have to be Kim Kardashian to afford something like this. And so out of this project, actually, we recently received a grant from New York State for establishing the New York Fashion Innovation Center, headquartered at RPI, which is tasked with supplying seed grants for anyone working in the sustainable textile space in New York, as well as provide equipment for a textile fiber prototyping testing lab at RPI, which anyone can use. It's a shared user facility. So if you have questions about that, please get in touch with me. And lastly, I'd like to acknowledge my research group, as well as the many collaborators that I have here at RPI that has made our work truly impactful.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was really exciting.